Welcome to World Revolution Channel. We're going to deep dive into one of the biggest bestseller books in Amazon history, a book that I think fundamentally changes how we view risk, success, and even just everyday life.
It really does.
This deep dive is all about recognizing that our world is far messier and, more chaotic than we pretend. And crucially, that this messiness isn't a problem to be solved, it's a feature to be exploited.
That is precisely the core message. We're diving into a pretty radical intellectual framework that argues for a profound separation in how we categorize everything around us.
Right.
If you feel like your life or your career or the systems you rely on are constantly being derailed by the unexpected, it's probably because those systems are built on a dangerous assumption.
That we can predict the future.
That we can predict the future. And our source material just dismantles that assumption. It offers an entirely new lens.
It frames the world around what it calls the triad. You have the fragile, the robust, and then this other thing, the antifragile. And I think most people, most institutions, they aim for robustness, for resilience. But the book argues that's not the goal.
No, it's not the ultimate state. Our mission today is to really understand this triad in detail and discover how to live in a way that truly gains from the unpredictable. We're exploring a non-predictive map for navigation.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's a massive body of work, so we're structuring this deep dive around the foundational arguments. First, we have to define the property itself, antifragility. What does it look like?
Right. What is it, and where did the idea come from?
Second, we'll get into the tragic failures of modernity, which so often tries to deny disorder, and the harm this denial causes.
And finally, we'll build that non-predictive map for navigating total uncertainty, focusing on things like asymmetry and optionality.
Great. So let's start with the absolute basics. If something is fragile, like a glass or, I guess, a detailed economic plan, stress makes it break.
It shatters.
If it's robust, stress leaves it unchanged. So the opposite of fragile is, well, you'd assume it's robust. But that's not what the book says.
That's the critical mistake. The word robust implies endurance, resistance, or survival, despite volatility. But look at nature. Right? It doesn't just survive volatility, it thrives on it. We needed a new word because the real opposite of fragility is something that actively benefits from stress, disorder, volatility, randomness. All of it. These aren't negative inputs for an anti-fragile system. They're essential fuel. They make it stronger or fitter or wealthier.
I think the elemental analogy you mentioned before we started really clarifies this.
It does. Think of wind. Wind is pure volatility, pure randomness.
Okay.
Wind extinguishes a candle. That's fragile. But if you hit a bonfire with that same wind, it energizes the fire, it strengthens it, it's anti-fragile. The fire needs the randomness and chaos of the airflow to fully thrive.
And you see the opposite, too. If you deprive a system of that stress, it withers.
Exactly. You put an astronaut in zero gravity, you take away all the physical stress, and what happens? Rapid decay, bone loss, muscle atrophy. Stress isn't just something to be endured, it's vital information.
So if this property is so fundamental, why are we only just now giving it a name? Were there, ancient concepts that got close to this?
Oh, absolutely. You see what we might call proto-antifragility baked into ancient survival mechanisms and folk wisdom. One of the best examples is Mithridization.
Mithridization, that's the one about King Mithridates IV, who protected himself against poisoning by taking tiny, sublethal doses of poison over time. A fascinating story.
It is, but it also perfectly illustrates the limits of just being robust. That small exposure, it leads to immunity against larger doses of that specific poison.
Right.
The story of Agrippina, Emperor Nero's mother, is even better at showing the failure mode here.
She thought her son, Nero, was trying to poison her, so she did the same thing, took small doses to immunize herself.
Yes. And she achieved a very high level of robustness against toxins. But as you can guess, it didn't save her in the end.
Because he used a different kind of stressor.
Exactly. He wasn't robust against everything. Nero eventually just had her assassinated with a sword. The shock, the source of volatility, was completely different from the one she prepared for. She wasn't anti-fragile, she was just narrowly robust. You can't immunize yourself against all possible harms.
That makes perfect sense. Robustness is specific, it's bounded. Anti-fragility has to gain from the general principle of disorder. So how does hormesis, the next concept, get us a step closer?
Hormesis is critical because it introduces the idea of non-linearity, which is really the engine of antifragility. It's when a small dose of something that would normally be harmful is actually beneficial for the organism, making it better overall.
So it's not just I survived the stressor, it's I am now a better system because of the stressor. Can you give me a real-world example of that gain?
Sure, think about something like fasting or controlled calorie restriction. Obviously, starvation is harmful. But controlled intermittent caloric stress triggers all these beneficial processes, like autophagy, where the body literally self-cleans and recycles damaged cells.
So that little bit of episodic harm forces the organism to get more efficient.
Exactly. It strengthens its repair mechanisms, making it fitter, potentially even extending its life. That is a clear gain, a net positive, that comes directly from a controlled stress input.
And that leads us right to one of the core mechanisms, overcompensation. If stress is information, how does the system translate that information into actual strength?
The mechanism is actually pretty simple, but it's incredibly profound. When an organic system is stressed, it doesn't just go back to where it was before, it overcompensates. It builds itself back stronger to protect itself against a slightly larger stressor in the future.
So it's an overreaction.
It's a deliberate overreaction to the signal. That's where the gain comes from. And it's why depriving systems of these vital episodic stressors is so harmful. You're taking away the knowledge the system needs to strengthen itself.
Well, we see this in biology all the time. I'm thinking of skeletal and muscular systems. Wolff's Law, for instance.
Wolff's Law is the perfect demonstration. It shows that your bones literally get denser and stronger in direct response to the specific episodic stress they encounter. And it's not linear.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you put a slight constant pressure on a bone, it doesn't do much. But if you apply a maximum high-intensity load, say from lifting a very heavy weight, the bone signals the body to deposit extra mineral density. It's anticipating the future need for that strength.
So if I want to be anti-fragile in the gym, I shouldn't be doing endless reps with light weights.
Precisely. If your goal is maximum strength, lifting a very heavy weight once is vastly superior. That maximum or near maximum lift sends a strong, clear signal of potential failure, and the body overcompensates dramatically. It's a nonlinear benefit. The goal isn't to be robust to the weight you just lifted. It's to be robust to one that's 10% heavier tomorrow.
Okay, let's pivot to redundancy. In a modern corporate setting, redundancy is like the ultimate enemy. It's inefficient, it's waste, spare parts, extra cash on the balance sheet. It's all seen as a drag.
And that view of efficiency is incredibly fragile. It's a time bomb. Redundancy, when you look at it through the antifragility lens, is a strategic, highly aggressive, and potentially very profitable stance. It's not just a safety buffer. It's an optionality generator.
An optionality generator. Explain what you mean by that.
Okay, say you have extra inventory. Let's say you're stockpiling oil reserves, or you have extra manufacturing capacity just sitting idle. When times are calm, it looks wasteful on the spreadsheet. But when a major disruption hits, a political crisis, a supply chain collapse, that inefficient surplus is suddenly worth 5 or 10 times its normal price.
So you're not just protected from the downside.
You're not just protected from the shortage, you also gain a massive financial upside from the volatility. That surplus transforms from a cost center into a call option on chaos.
So what looks like inefficiency for the single unit becomes this incredible opportunity for the savvy actor who holds that redundancy.
Yeah. The fragile actor, they minimize redundancy to maximize short-term profit. They have a guaranteed upside of, say, $1 and a potential catastrophic downside of minus $100 in a crisis. The anti-fragile actor accepts a small cost, the cost of carrying that surplus for downside protection and a massive, almost unlimited upside.
This tension, where inefficiency at the unit level creates strength at the system level, that brings us to what might be the toughest concept in the whole book. The idea that the anti-fragility of the collective often requires the fragility of the individual.
A harsh truth, especially for our modern sensibilities, which are so obsessed with individual safety. But think about it. Individual organisms are fragile. They age, they get sick, they die. They're perishable units.
But the species, the gene pool itself.
The gene pool, the information they carry, is anti-fragile.
So nature is basically using the death and failure of individuals, plus genetic variations and random shocks, to enhance the fitness of the species over generations. The individual is a sacrificial unit.
Exactly. Nature is ruthlessly efficient at processing information. It prioritizes the survival and integrity of the system's information, the genetic code, over the lifespan of any single creature. The individual is just a data point that, through its failure, helps optimize the larger code.
I have to push back a little here, though. Isn't the whole point of modern society, medicine, safety nets, insurance, to mitigate that ruthless natural process? Are you saying that trying to make things safe is actually a flaw?
That's an excellent question. We
Yeah.
have to distinguish between preventing ruin, which is the goal of robustness,
Right.
and preventing volatility, which is often the unintended consequence of trying to protect every individual excessively.
Okay.
Modernity struggles because we want the anti-fragility of the collective, a thriving economy, robust institutions, but we don't want to accept the necessary fragility of the parts. We don't want to see small businesses fail or inefficient employees get replaced.
Let's apply this to economics. The book uses a great restaurant analogy.
Yes, individual restaurants are incredibly fragile. Most fail within 5 years. They open, they compete ruthlessly, they innovate, and then they close. This is obviously painful for the owner.
But for the diner, for the city's food scene.
For the collective dining economy, it's anti-fragile. The consumer benefits from high-quality, low prices, and constant innovation that's enforced by the market's evolutionary pressure. That constant, localized volatility is what makes the whole system great.
And the moment you introduce something like systemic bailouts.
You completely reverse that healthy failure mechanism. You protect the unfit individual, the too-big-to-fail bank, or the struggling chain, at the expense of the overall system's health. You transfer fragility from the individual, who should have faced the consequences, to the taxpayer. That makes the entire economy less responsive and more prone to a catastrophic coordinated failure later on.
So small, frequent failures are essential information. They prevent the big systemic catastrophes. This connects directly to how we manage errors in critical infrastructure.
Absolutely. Think about the Titanic. Its sinking was a terrible tragedy, but it was a contained, localized error. That consequence was immediately converted into safety information.
Right, they mandated sufficient lifeboats, improved iceberg watches.
They altered shipping routes. The resulting safety improvements have probably saved far more lives than were lost on that one ship. The system was anti-fragile because it was set up to learn from and exploit that painful, specific error.
And every plane crash, as tragic as it is, makes the next flight safer because aviation is designed to learn from those confined errors immediately.
Now, contrast that with our interconnected economic systems. When the globalized financial system acts as one gigantic, singular unit with complex derivatives connecting banks all over the world, an error that starts in one small mortgage market doesn't stay confined.
It spreads, it compounds.
Exactly. Economic crashes often don't improve the system because the consequences of failure are transferred to the public, and the structure that allows the failure isn't localized, it's systemic.
That's the transfer of fragility. Some people get to be anti-fragile, they benefit from the chaos, at the expense of others who are forced to bear the downside risk.
The individual unit avoids the necessary pain, and the system as a whole absorbs this hidden growing risk. Which is why the solution isn't to eliminate shocks, but to localize them, to make sure the fragility stays with the unit that can afford to fail and provide that crucial information to the wider system.
This is a perfect segue into Book 2, which really examines this tragic flaw of modernity. We are so obsessed with eliminating risk and volatility through centralized planning and naive intervention that we just end up hiding fragility, making the inevitable blow-up so much worse.
The tragedy is this widespread belief that stability is always a good thing. The attempt to squeeze out all volatility just accumulates silent, catastrophic risks beneath the surface. It's like shaking a soda bottle for 10 minutes and then expecting to open it calmly. This is where the concept of iatrogenics becomes absolutely central.
Iatrogenics, the harm caused by the healer, or the helper. The source material really emphasizes the old Hippocratic oath, primum non nocere, first do no harm. But it seems like we've completely forgotten that.
We have. Despite that ancient wisdom, we're constantly engaged in this naive interventionism. It's driven by the belief that we must do something, even when the system would be better off left alone. Iatrogenics is the refusal to accept a system's natural anti-fragility, its own ability to self-heal and self-optimize.
And the term itself has only become common recently.
Yes, because the scale of harm caused by well-intentioned, centralized interference has just grown exponentially.
And there's a huge incentive problem driving this, isn't there?
It's fundamental to human behavior. It's much easier to get rewarded for a visible, expensive action. Look what I did for you. The doctor who performs a risky, high-profile surgery gets far more credit and money than the doctor who advises the patient to just go home, rest, and let their body's own robust mechanisms do the work.
We reward the hero who intervenes.
We reward the hero who intervenes over the hero who wisely omits. We reward doing over not doing, even when omission, or what the book calls via negativa, is the path of superior wisdom.
Because the hero who prevents a calamity by not acting, Well, you never see the calamity, so they get no credit.
Exactly. The system only rewards the person who fixes the visible problem, even if they secretly caused a larger, invisible problem down the line.
But let's look at the flip side of that. The opposite of iatrogenics, when someone tries to cause harm but actually ends up helping the system.
This is a fascinating part of it. Attackers or critics can inadvertently introduce necessary stress. Think about cybersecurity. Malicious hackers expose vulnerabilities in a system.
Right.
This forces developers to overcompensate, to build stronger defenses, making the entire system anti-fragile to future attacks. Or think about the world of ideas. Critics who obsessively attack a message can inadvertently help it spread. Their relentless attacks act like the wind on the fire. They drive people to examine the arguments and give the idea visibility it might never have had otherwise.
We see this exact same incentive structure, the one that favors short-term, visible action, play out on a massive scale in political systems. The book argues that artificially suppressed volatility is a time bomb.
It's the ultimate act of transferring fragility. When you artificially maintain stability, you're just masking risk. You're accumulating all this silent tension beneath the surface. And the longer that apparent stability lasts, the worse the eventual blow-up will be, because none of the stresses have been released in small, manageable bursts.
And this has had some pretty major foreign policy implications. When powerful governments decide to support stable but, let's say, rotten regimes.
Well, the book's argument, looking at historical policy, is that supporting certain autocratic regimes, say pre-2011 Egypt or other fragile dictatorships, in the name of avoiding chaos is a perfect example. The argument is always better the devil you know.
Better than the instability of a revolution.
But this policy just prevents the necessary small bits of noise and volatility. It stops the system from self-correcting. And when the dam inevitably breaks,
the blow-up is a much larger, more violent catastrophe, a black swan event that can destabilize an entire region.
Precisely. Suppressing small volatility prevents the system from generating necessary information, which leads to these massive, unexpected political fragilities. The only way to get true, long-term stability is to embrace continuous, localized, small-scale volatility.
So, if the centralized, stability-obsessed state is fragile, what does an anti-fragile political system look like? The book points to the Swiss model.
Switzerland is described as highly anti-fragile. It tends to benefit from shocks that destabilize its more centralized neighbors precisely because it is radically decentralized. It lacks a large, powerful central government that can make singular, massive errors.
The control is bottom-up.
It's bottom-up. It's municipal. It's cantonal.
We tend to confuse a lack of central authority with chaos, but the argument here is the opposite.
This bottom-up structure generates what's called a boring stability through continuous, localized, small volatility. If there's a problem with zoning or taxes, it's a localized dispute. It only affects one or two cantons. The rest of the nation just keeps functioning, absorbing the shock. The problems are forced to remain small.
It's an unintellectual structure, in a way. It's designed to prevent the catastrophic failures that come from grand, top-down, rational plans.
Exactly. It avoids the romanticism of utopias. And, just as importantly, decentralization protects against systemic manipulation. For instance, lobbyists can't really operate effectively in that kind of system.
Why is that? You'd think that it'd be everywhere.
Because lobbyists want a high return on their investment. They want a single point of failure they can influence. A capital city, a Brussels, a Washington, D.C., a place where influencing one ruling body yields a huge payout for their corporate client.
But if they have to lobby 26 different cantonal parliaments...
the cost and effort just outweigh the benefit. Decentralization is a structural defense against that kind of institutional fragility.
This systemic denial of volatility also has a really profound psychological effect on us as individuals. The book calls this the neurotic citizen.
Modernity has completely overwhelmed us with noise. And by noise, I mean high-frequency, random, useless information. We are bombarded constantly, and it confuses our ability to find the signal, the information that actually matters for our survival or success.
Right.
This constant barrage acts like a chronic stressor, and it transforms people into neurotics who overreact to every small, normal setback. A tiny dip in the market is a sign of global collapse. A small pimple becomes cancer. We lose the ability to distinguish a fluctuation from a trend.
And a lot of this is media-driven.
It's media-driven neuroticism. Newspapers, cable news, social media feeds, they have to fill pages and airtime every single day, whether or not anything significant has actually happened. They sell us junk food information.
High-frequency, low-signal stressors.
Right. It's like eating refined sugar all day.
Mhm.
It confuses our biological system. Too much information becomes harmful, and it causes us to intervene when we really shouldn't.
So how do we fight this? How do we fight the constant urge to intervene and the information overload? It comes back to the power of omission, this via negativa.
The via negativa, the subtractive approach, is the cornerstone of anti-fragile living. It means recognizing that getting better often means subtracting what is harmful rather than adding more complexity or more information. The first step is always to identify the source of fragility and remove it.
This is an old philosophical idea. Wu-wei, passive achievement, or festina lente, make haste slowly.
Right. Wu-wei recognizes that the best outcome is often achieved by just allowing the system's natural anti-fragility to work without clumsy intervention. And festina lente is about resisting the modern pressure for constant, immediate action. Even procrastination, which we see as a weakness, can be a natural defense mechanism. It lets unimportant things die on their own and lets robust solutions emerge on their own time.
And this same pressure to do something leads us right back to iatrogenics in our own personal health care, even with something that seems totally benign, like regular checkups.
The risk of naive intervention is everywhere. Take something simple, like monitoring your blood pressure. That number is naturally variable. It fluctuates based on what you ate, how you slept, your stress level that morning.
But modern medicine often treats that variability like it's a disease.
Exactly. If you have a personal doctor and you get frequent unnecessary checkups, the doctor feels pressure to justify their salary. They might see one naturally high reading, a random deviation, not a crisis, and feel compelled to prescribe medication.
This is what the book calls a concave case.
Yes, a situation where the benefits of intervention are small and linear, but the potential side effects and risks are large and nonlinear. So we start medicating normal, natural variability, which can lead to reduced life expectancy because now the patient is subject to the side effects of constant medication for a problem that probably would have just self-corrected.
It's described as a legal way to kill people.
By over-medicating them for non-pathological variations. The anti-fragile approach is to let the body self-regulate, unless a symptom is truly life-threatening or chronic. The via negativa in healthcare is often choosing to do less. Eat better, sleep more, and let the system run its course, rather than opting for a risky, complex intervention.
Okay, so if modernity's obsession with intervention and stability creates all this hidden fragility, and if we accept that the world is governed by massive, unpredictable black swans, how do we survive, let alone thrive? This is book 3, which argues that the solution is not better prediction, it's building systems that make prediction irrelevant.
We have to accept the mathematical limit to our knowledge in what the book calls the black swan domain. Social life, economic life. They're just too complex, too interconnected, too nonlinear for any kind of reliable long-term prediction.
This is the non-turkey problem.
This is the non-turkey problem. The turkey is fed for 1,000 days and concludes, based on all available data, that humans love him unconditionally. And then comes a major unpredictable surprise on day 1,001.
Thanksgiving.
Right. And you, the fragile actor, are the turkey. The solution is separation. You have to focus only on making yourself robust against ruin or actively anti-fragile. If you can do that, the accuracy of any forecast just stops mattering. Prediction is a sucker's game in this world.
And you replace that fragile need for prediction with redundancy.
Absolutely. Redundancy is a non-predictive mode of action. If you have extra cash, some gold bars, stockpiled food, you don't need to know if the next event is a war or an earthquake or a hyperinflation event.
Yeah.
You are protected, period. You have an option on chaos. But those who are fragile, deeply in debt, highly leveraged, they need an almost impossible level of prediction accuracy just to stay afloat.
This non-predictive approach also completely challenges how we think about innovation and knowledge. It introduces what's called the lecturing birds how to fly effect.
This is sometimes called the Soviet Harvard illusion. It's the assumption that formal, theoretical, organized science, the kind that comes out of universities or government agencies, is what leads to wealth and technology and innovation.
We assume the scientist creates the technology, which then creates the wealth.
But the causal arrow is so often reversed. Often, it's wealth and chaotic, evolutionary tinkering that generate the theoretical understanding later, and then that theory is dressed up and claimed to be the source of the innovation all along. We try to intellectualize what was an inherently non-intellectual, anti-fragile process of trial and error.
The classic example is something like the jet engine.
Take the jet engine. It was built primarily through aggressive trial and error tinkering, and raw engineering intuition. It wasn't derived from initial theoretical knowledge, from pure academic physics. The successful engineering came before the elegant mathematical theorems, which were often added afterwards to satisfy the intellectual bean counter and create a clean story.
So technology is driven by anti-fragile tinkering, not top-down planning.
It's driven by aggressive risk-bearing on small bets. The people who actually make the world work, the engineers, the plumbers, the mechanics, they are often engaged in these non-predictive, anti-fragile processes, even if they can't write a paper about the theory behind it. They possess non-narrative knowledge.
This clash between formal knowledge and practical street-smart wisdom brings us to one of my favorite parts of the book, Fat Tony debating Socrates. It's really about payoff versus pure logic.
Fat Tony represents the kind of knowledge that focuses on payoff, not probability. His entire worldview is governed by the sucker-non-sucker distinction. It doesn't matter if your prediction is 95% accurate if, in that 5% where you're wrong, you lose everything.
Decisions should rely on asymmetry and fragility, not how accurate your prediction is.
And that's why the greatest mistake is mistaking the unintelligible for the unintelligent. People who can't articulate their wisdom in a neat narrative aren't necessarily stupid. We know more than we think we do, often through deep-seated tradition or a gut feeling that just resists a clean explanation.
This reminds me of Cato the Elder.
A perfect example. He was deeply allergic to the Greek philosophers and doctors of his time. He feared their naive rationalism would introduce fragility into the robust structure of Roman tradition. He saw their theoretical knowledge, because it was incomplete, as inherently dangerous.
He feared the iatrogenics of philosophy.
Exactly. He intuitively understood that the long-standing Roman traditions, the result of thousands of years of trial and error, had already filtered out the toxic ideas. Introducing flashy new theories could break the whole system.
This intuition-based, payoff-driven knowledge is captured perfectly by the green lumber fallacy.
It's one of the greatest lessons about the limits of superficial knowledge. It describes a trader who made millions trading something called green lumber. When someone asked him if he knew what green lumber was, he confidently said it was wood that was painted green.
Which it isn't.
Not at all. It's freshly cut, unseasoned wood. But the key realization was that whether the lumber was actually green or not was completely irrelevant to his success. The knowledge he needed was all about trading dynamics, market psychology, logistics, the hidden, complex mechanics, not the superficial, narratable property.
So the intellectual focuses on the cosmetic details, while the practical operator focuses on the payoff.
Look at Fat Tony's trade on the rumor that war would raise oil prices. Every analyst on TV was saying, war in the Middle East means high oil prices. Tony made millions betting against that. Why? Because, as he would say, Kuwait and oil are not the same thing. The real knowledge was that the expectation of high prices was already baked into the current price.
So betting on the consensus was a fragile move.
A low payoff, high fragility move. The real knowledge is in identifying the asymmetry, not just believing the obvious story.
We've established that we can't predict and that we should trust this non-narrative wisdom. The ultimate synthesis for how to survive then lies in managing asymmetry, which brings us to Stoicism and Seneca's barbell.
Success and power create their own fragility. Because they introduce this massive asymmetry, you suddenly have much more to lose than you have to gain. This is the sort of Damocles effect. Wealth traps people by making them worry excessively about the downside, which makes them emotionally fragile.
And Seneca, the Roman Stoic, understood this. He wanted to reduce that emotional fragility first.
Stoicism was a system designed for emotional robustification. The first step toward anti-fragility is to mitigate your downside risk, to make yourself robust against fate. Seneca believed you had to separate yourself from your dependence on circumstances, making yourself psychologically immune to the inevitable reversals of fortune.
Mentally prepare for the worst.
If you prepare for the worst, when it happens, it carries no surprise and much less emotional cost. So once you've mitigated that fragility, once the risk of ruining is gone, then you can pursue the aggressive strategy, the barbell.
The barbell strategy is the core practical takeaway, a dual approach. Extreme risk aversion on one side and extreme risk-taking on the other.
And you explicitly avoid the fragile, mushy, golden middle of moderate risk.
Why is the moderate middle the most fragile position?
Because the middle is where you're susceptible to huge, hidden measurement errors. If you put all of your money into a medium-risk investment, you are deceiving yourself. You think you're balanced, but you're actually fully exposed to an unexpected black swan. The moderate middle is where all the nasty, non-linear surprises live.
The barbell forces you to be honest about your risks.
Yes. In finance, it would be putting 90% of your assets in safe, boring, protected cash equivalents. That's your extreme risk aversion. And then you put 10% in maximally risky, speculative, high optionality ventures. This guarantees your maximum loss is 10%. That's robust. But it also exposes you to massive, unlimited upside. That's the anti-fragile side.
And this whole strategy depends on optionality, which the book calls the philosopher's stone.
Optionality is the asymmetry we're all hunting for. It's the ability to pay a small, confined cost to access a potentially huge gain. You benefit much more when you're right than you are hurt when you're wrong.
Let's make this crystal clear with the Thales analogy.
The philosopher Thales. He decided to profit from his wisdom. He secured options on all the olive presses in his region. He paid a small, fixed amount of money, a tiny rent, to control the presses for the upcoming harvest. If the olive crop failed, he lost his small rent. That was it. But if the crop was huge, he rented the presses out at a massive premium and made a fortune. Small, capped loss. Huge, uncapped potential gain.
And crucially, Thales didn't need to predict the crop yield accurately.
Exactly. He just needed the option. He only needed to limit his downside and exploit the upside asymmetry. Optionality lets us be ignorant. It lets us get massive results without precise knowledge or prediction. Trial and error is anti-fragile tinkering because each error carries a small, defined cost, while the huge gains, once you find them, can be exploited aggressively.
This brings us to the idea that life itself can be managed this way. The book calls it being long gamma.
Long gamma is the technical term for having a portfolio of options, where small bits of volatility create large positive changes in your total value. Applied to life, it means constantly engaging in low-cost, high-upside exploration. It's like buying a portfolio of cheap lottery tickets. You know 99% will fail, but the 1% that hits will cover all your losses and give you a massive return.
And the practical application of this is to adopt the mindset of the rational flanner.
The flanner is the opportunistic wanderer, the person who is constantly revising their plan based on new information and new opportunities that the environment presents. Contrast that with the fragile tourist who is locked into a rigid itinerary, a plan that fails the moment a flight is canceled.
Right.
The rational flanner is constantly exposed to positive black swans, unexpected meetings, accidental discoveries, random bits of information, because they benefit from volatility. Life becomes long gamma when you're positioned to exploit unexpected variation.
That is an incredibly powerful and challenging framework. We started by defining antifragility gaining from disorder, and we ended up with a practical, non-predictive strategy, the barbell. Modern society struggles precisely because it prizes this naive rationalism, this need to predict, and it fails to recognize the essential, invisible antifragility in nature and messy, decentralized systems.
And if we synthesize all of this, the key takeaway is really the supreme importance of via negativa. Getting better so often means subtraction, not addition. It means removing the sources of fragility, removing unnecessary intervention, removing the volatility suppressors that create systemic risk, and removing the overwhelming information overload that makes us all neurotic.
And maybe most importantly, we learned about the ethical imperative that's necessary for any healthy system. Thou shalt not have anti-fragility at the expense of others. When those in power, the decision makers, the regulators, don't have skin in the game, when they don't share in the downside risk of their own decisions, they become immune to consequences.
And that lack of exposure is the greatest societal fragilizer there is. It guarantees that the public will be the one to bear the catastrophic losses.
It's an ancient lesson.
It is. Hammurabi's Code, which stipulated that a builder whose house collapsed and killed the owner should himself be put to death. That's a system that understands the need for symmetry of fragility. We have to look around and ask, where does that asymmetry exist today? And we must demand exposure from those in power.
The concept of less is more really is robust to error. If an idea or a decision requires too many reasons, too much complicated rationalization, it's probably a fragile self-deception. It's trying to get you to ignore simple, robust principles. We need to seek out those simple, non-narrative barbell solutions in our own lives.
We've seen that the greatest discoveries often spring from necessity and anti-fragile tinkering, not from some top-down plan. So the next step for you, the listener, is to look around your own life and ask, where am I most fragile? Where can I apply the barbell by separating my life into small, contained risk and overwhelming stability? And what unintelligent-looking traditions might actually be sophisticated forms of inherited anti-fragility? These concepts provide the map to live happily and profitably in a world we fundamentally do not understand.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe. Follow up in the next topic. Continue next topic.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're kind of moving beyond just defining anti-fragility, the idea that some things get stronger from chaos.
Right.
We're shifting gears now, moving into the practical phase, the application. It's almost like we're opening the instruction manual for how to actually live in a world that's, fundamentally volatile and unpredictable.
This is exactly where the rubber meets the road, isn't it?
It is. It's all about how you actively structure your life, your decisions, everything to really leverage that disorder instead of just trying to hide from it, which never really works.
And for this deep dive, that's what we're tackling. We're getting into the material from books 4 all the way through 7. And our mission really is to get a handle on the concrete structures of uncertainty.
So what's the roadmap?
We're looking at 4, I'd say, monumental pillars that give you actual actionable insights.
Yeah.
First, we'll talk about optionality and how it's a much more potent substitute for what we think of as formal intelligence.
Yeah, optionality. Second, we'll get into nonlinearity. It's the key to detecting fragility in pretty much any complex system. Then third, the wisdom of subtraction. The idea of via negativa.
Less is more.
Less is more, exactly. And finally, the really crucial part, the ethical side of all this, the absolute necessity of having skin in the game. These aren't just abstract ideas. They're like filters you can use to protect yourself from the worst stuff while opening yourself up to all the hidden good stuff.
All right, let's start there. Book 4, optionality. I think the best way into this whole concept is probably that ancient story about Thales of Miletus. It's just like a perfect little anecdote for explaining an asymmetric payoff.
It's totally foundational. So you've got Thales, this philosopher, mathematician, and he gets a hunch. Maybe he anticipates, maybe he just hypothesizes that a huge olive harvest is on its way.
And he's not using like sophisticated weather models or anything?
No, not at all. He's not predicting, he's structuring. He goes out and spends a pretty small sum of money, a really modest initial payment. And with that, he secures the rights to use all the olive presses in the area, Miletus and Chios.
So that initial payment, that's his entire risk.
That's his maximum downside. It's totally capped. He knows from day one exactly how much he can possibly lose. It's a known quantity.
And this is where the genius of it kicks in, right? The anti-fragility is baked right into that deal when the massive harvest actually happens, just like he thought it might.
He suddenly has a monopoly on the means of production. Everyone needs the presses, and he's the only one who has them.
So he can charge whatever he wants, monopoly prices. The profit is, it's potentially unlimited. But if he'd been wrong, if the harvest failed,
he just loses that small deposit. That's it. Limited loss on one side, basically unlimited gain on the other. That is a perfect picture of a convex or anti-fragile bet.
This is the definition of a free option then.
It is. He bought the right, but critically, not the obligation to use those presses. The asymmetry is everything. He didn't need to be some kind of super profit. He just had to structure his bet so that he would, smile when volatility showed up. He benefited from the uncertainty itself.
And this insight just immediately throws into relief how wrong most of our formal systems get it.
Oh, absolutely. And what's really fascinating is how the entire intellectual tradition that came after him, starting with Aristotle, just completely missed the point of what Thales did.
How so?
Well, Aristotle acknowledged that Thales made a lot of money, sure, but he kind of dismissed it as a distraction from pure philosophy. He said something like, see, if philosophers wanted to make money, they easily could. He was championing episteme. That's the formal textbook theoretical knowledge.
Thales wasn't using theory.
Not at all. He was using techna, practical knowledge, tinkering, knowing how to structure a good bet, the kind of knowledge that, you can only really get when you have some skin in the game.
The source material is really pointed on this. It calls it the flaw of the Soviet Harvard intellectual circles, this bias towards clean theories over messy real-world results.
And that leads directly to the lecturing birds how to fly effect. It's a kind of causal illusion.
Okay, break that down. A causal illusion.
It's when you see two things happening together and you assume one caused the other, but you've actually got the cause and effect backward. For example, we see that rich, advanced societies spend a ton of money on academic research.
And so we assume the research created the wealth.
Exactly. We jump to that conclusion. But in many cases, it's actually the other way around. The wealth creates a surplus, a luxury, that allows a society to fund all this abstract, sometimes completely impractical academic work. The research is often just a side effect of prosperity, an epiphenomenon, not its primary driver.
There's some pretty damning historical evidence for that, isn't there? I mean, if formal education was the main engine of wealth, the world would look very different.
It would. I mean, look at countries like Korea and Taiwan back in, say, 1960. Their literacy rates were surprisingly low, much lower than, for example, Argentina or the Philippines at the time.
But Argentina and the Philippines didn't see that same explosive growth.
Not even close. Korea and Taiwan were driven by risk-taking entrepreneurs, really high savings rates, a culture of aggressive tinkering, and they grew exponentially. Meanwhile, the highly literate but more bureaucratic economies just stagnated. Real innovation, the kind that creates wealth and optionality, it seems to bubble up from the bottom through what the book calls rational trial and error.
And this idea of tinkering is so important because it points to one of our biggest limitations, right? Our failure of imagination.
A profound limitation. We are just shockingly bad at predicting which new technologies will actually change the world. We have to let randomness and trial and error kind of spoon-feed us these discoveries.
You just have to look at the classic examples.
The two best ones are the wheeled suitcase and the Mesoamerican wheel. I mean, think about it. We had wheels for thousands of years. We had luggage for thousands of years. But the simple idea of putting the wheels on the luggage, that didn't happen until the 1970s.
That's an unbelievable failure of imagination. Just connecting two dots that are right next to each other.
It's astounding. And even more striking is the wheel in Mesoamerica. Civilizations like the Mayans, they invented the wheel. We have the artifacts, but they only used them for children's toys.
They never used them for transport.
Never. They had the technology but failed completely to see the application. They were still relying on sheer human labor to move everything. It just shows you that innovation isn't a straight line that some smart person maps out. It comes from tinkering, from options. The failures have to be cheap and the successes can be massive.
And the system that allows for that, for those small, manageable errors, is the one that ultimately wins.
Which brings us right to the difference between the knowledge you can see and talk about and the deep, invisible knowledge of the practitioner, the green lumber fallacy.
Okay, the green lumber fallacy. This is the one about mistaking the story for the actual skill.
Exactly. You mistake the narratable knowledge, the economic theories, the definitions you can write down in a book, for the actual necessary knowledge you need to succeed in a domain.
And the story comes from a real trader.
A famously successful one. He made an absolute fortune trading what's called green lumber. And someone asked him about it, the specifics of the commodity. He admitted he thought green lumber was just lumber that had been painted green.
When it's actually freshly cut, unseasoned wood.
Right. His formal textbook knowledge was completely wrong, but his results were spectacular. Why? Because he didn't need the definition. He understood the hidden structure, the market dynamics, the non-narratable stuff, the heuristics of the game.
And that kind of intuition, that's what defines practitioners like the character Fat Tony. He excels by detecting fragility, not by predicting probabilities.
That's the key difference. Take his bet during the Kuwait War. When Iraq invaded, every single pundit, every economist, they all said oil prices were going to skyrocket. It's a simple, clean story, right? War in the Middle East means supply disruption, which means higher prices.
It's the obvious narrative.
The obvious narrative. But Tony bet against it. He shorted oil.
Why? What did he see that nobody else did?
He realized that everyone was conflating the event, the war, with the market's exposure to that event. He saw that the risk of a conflict was already in the price. The market had already discounted it. So when the news actually broke and everyone piled into the trade, it caused a squeeze and a collapse.
So he wasn't trying to predict the future. He was looking at the structure of the bet itself.
Precisely. He was looking for where everyone else was fragile because they were clinging to an overly simple cause and effect story. He saw the structure, not the headline. That's optionality in practice.
Okay, so that leads us really nicely into Book V, which is all about the mechanics of complexity. If we have to accept that prediction is basically a fool's errand, we need another tool, right? A way to see where the danger is. And that tool is nonlinearity.
Yes. Linearity is the simple world of the classroom. You double the input, you get double the output, a nice, clean, straight line. But as soon as a system gets even a little bit complex, that entire assumption it breaks down.
And nonlinearity becomes the rule, not the exception.
It becomes the simple detection rule for fragility. If you double the stress on something and the negative effect more than doubles if it accelerates, you're looking at a fragile system. The book calls this a concave relationship. It curves down like a frown.
And the opposite is true for antifragility.
Exactly. If you double the stressor and the benefit more than doubles, you have a convex relationship. It curves up like a smile. That curvature tells you everything you need to know about how a system will respond to shocks without needing to predict the shocks themselves.
This isn't just some minor detail, then. This is like the source code for systemic risk.
It is. And a great way to make it tangible is with that image of a large stone versus 1,000 tiny pebbles.
Right. Both systems have the exact same total weight.
Same weight. But system A is one single, huge, concentrated stone. System B is 1,000 little pebbles, all distributed. Now, which one is more robust?
Well, the pebbles, obviously.
Yeah.
If you drop a pebble, who cares? The system is fine. You drop the big stone, it shatters. Total catastrophic loss.
And that's the point. The concentrated system is fragile. The distributed system is robust or even anti-fragile. And this analogy scales up perfectly to how we think about organizations and even cities.
The book is really adamant about this point, that we get size comparisons totally wrong. A big company isn't just a bigger version of a small business.
No, it's a completely different animal. A city is not just a large village. Size itself introduces a whole new level of complexity, of hidden interdependencies. In a village, relationships are simple. You can see how things work. In a giant city, one broken traffic light can cascade into total gridlock because everything is so tightly connected.
And that complexity creates these nonlinear, unpredictable responses.
It does. The bigger you get, and often the more optimized and centralized you become, the harder it is to predict what's going to happen. You're actually making yourself more fragile, not less.
This sounds like what the book calls the curse of efficiency. We design all these systems, supply chains, banks, to be perfectly lean, to cut out all the fat, all the redundancy.
Because we think we're maximizing value, but what we're really doing is engineering for perfect fragility. Redundancy is constantly mislabeled as waste.
But it's not waste.
It's optionality. It's a buffer. It's insurance. When you over-optimize a system, it becomes brittle. It's designed to work perfectly under normal conditions, but when that rare, high-impact event, a black swan, comes along, it has no capacity to absorb the shock. It just breaks.
The Kerfil scandal of the French bank, Société Générale, is a perfect financial example of this.
A horrifyingly perfect example. So this one trader, Kerfil, builds up this massive unauthorized position, something like 70 billion euros worth of stock exposure. It's an immense concentration of risk.
And when the bank finds out, they have to get rid of it fast.
They're forced into a fire sale. The sheer size of that position meant they had no options. They couldn't slowly unwind it over weeks. They had to dump it all on the market immediately.
Which, of course, drives the price down against them.
And it accelerates the drop. It's a purely concave, disproportionate loss. Their own size and concentration force them into a catastrophic, non-optional decision, a systemic squeeze. They paid the accelerating price of that nonlinearity.
And you can see this same principle at work in everyday life, too, in systems that have, like, physical limits.
Oh, absolutely. Think about traffic. Your travel time can't be negative, right? The absolute best you can do is arrive on time, so your benefit is capped at 0.
But your downside is unlimited.
Practically unlimited. If you add a little bit of uncertainty, an accident, some bad weather, the negative effects don't just add up, they compound nonlinearly. A small fender bender might add 10 minutes, but a major highway closure could add 5 hours. The harm accelerates while the benefit is capped. Pure concavity.
This is why government projects always go over budget.
It's exactly why. Planners use linear average case estimates for systems that are inherently concave. They assume the average cost, the average timeline, but the harm from unexpected delays and problems always accumulates negatively, and it accelerates much faster than any benefit from things going unexpectedly well.
Which brings us to the next big trap, this mathematical illusion of the average, Jensen's inequality, and the grandmother paradox.
The grandmother paradox is such a simple and devastating way to understand this. So let's assume that 70 degrees Fahrenheit is the perfect optimal temperature for your grandmother's health.
Okay, 70 degrees, she's comfortable.
Right. If she spends 2 hours in a room that's at a constant, steady 70 degrees, her health is great, optimal. But now, what if she spends 1 hour in a room that's 0 degrees and 1 hour in a room that's 140 degrees?
Well, the average temperature is still 70 degrees.
The average is still 70, yes. But the outcome is catastrophic. She's dead.
So the key isn't the average, it's the volatility around the average.
It's the volatility. For any concave function, and health is a perfect example, as is the stability of a financial system, Variability is always, always harmful, even if the average input stays the same.
So mathematically, what's happening there?
What Jensen's inequality shows us is that for a concave function, the average of the function's output, her average health over time, is always going to be lower than the function of the average input. That gap between the two is the hidden harm of volatility.
And this explains why constant low-level stress can be so damaging.
Exactly. The daily grind of bureaucracy or constantly checking financial news or even too many doctor visits for minor things. It's not the average state that gets you. It's the continuous up and down, the volatility that wears down the concave system and pushes the overall function lower and lower, far below what the average would make you think.
The implications for planning and forecasting are just huge. This leads to what the book calls the inverse philosopher's stone.
Yes, the philosopher's stone was supposed to turn lead into gold. The inverse philosopher's stone is very real, and it turns gold into mud by systematically making things worse through prediction error. And it all comes from this concavity bias.
Walk us through how that bias works for, say, a government planner.
Okay, so a planner is forecasting something complex, like the national deficit or the budget for a war. They rely on point estimates. They take the single most likely average scenario for things like GDP growth or unemployment.
They're planning for the function of the average.
Precisely. But as we just established, these are deeply concave systems. The harm accelerates non-linearly when things go wrong. By completely ignoring the volatility that's inherent in all their assumptions, they are systematically, structurally underestimating the expected long-term harm.
So they're always too optimistic.
Always. The real expected cost, once you account for the accumulating tail risks and the non-linear errors, is always going to be worse. More expensive, longer, more spread out than they predict. And it's not because they're bad at their jobs. It's a structural error baked into the method itself. That's why big, fragile systems constantly underperform their forecasts.
So if prediction is an illusion and complexity is a trap, what's the actual way forward? This brings us to Book 6 and the idea of via negativa.
Yes, via negativa. It's a profound and simple principle, subtractive knowledge, the idea that you gain strength and health and robustness not by knowing what to add, but by knowing what to remove, what to avoid.
So it's easier to spot fragility and get rid of it than it is to try and engineer perfection from the ground up.
Infinitely easier. And more robust. Less is more. And simplicity. True simplicity is the ultimate sign of mastery.
It's often mistaken for being simple-minded, though.
It is, but it's the exact opposite. There's that famous quote, I think, from Steve Jobs about how you have to work incredibly hard to get your thinking clean enough to make it simple. The Arabs have a great phrase for it. No skill to understand it, mastery to write it.
And that's why heuristics, or rules of thumb, are so powerful.
They are. They aren't perfect academic theories. They're quick, dirty, robust rules that are designed to work under conditions of uncertainty. The goal of via negativa is to just stop meddling so much and let the simple, robust processes like evolution or time or markets do their work.
And this applies to our own decisions, too. I mean, if a choice is really the right one, you shouldn't need a huge spreadsheet to convince yourself of it.
That's the rule of one reason. It's a great personal heuristic. If you find yourself having to list a dozen different arguments to talk yourself into a big life decision, getting married, taking a job, whatever, you should probably just avoid it.
Because a robust decision should be obvious.
It should have a single, overwhelmingly powerful reason behind it. The moment you're making complex pro and con lists, you're admitting that the decision is fragile. It's sensitive to small errors in your own forecasts. The simple path is almost always the more resilient one.
This connects directly to the modern problem of just information overload. The constant news cycle is a perfect example of something we should be removing via negativa.
A classic example. We have to learn to distinguish signal from noise. Noise is just random, useless information. The 24/7 news cycle, especially financial news, is almost pure noise. And it has a real biological effect on us.
It just creates stress.
It does. It turns us into neurotics who are constantly reacting to meaningless random blips on a screen. It messes with our biological signaling systems.
The book compares it to our bodies dealing with the constant snacking versus having a few solid meals.
It's a perfect analogy. Your body is designed for the hormonal rush from a meal, but if you're eating all day every 10 minutes, it confuses your metabolism and leads to chronic disease. The mind is the same. It's built for occasional high-impact signals, not a continuous drip of low-level data. So applying via negativa here means you have to be aggressive about filtering out the noise. Focus only on the few things that actually matter.
Okay, so if simplicity is the goal, How do we know what's robust and what's just noise? This is where time comes in. Time is the ultimate filter.
Yes. If you think about time as just a long, continuous stream of volatility and stressors, then you realize that anything that has survived for a long time must have some anti-fragile properties. It's been tested.
And this is the basis of the Lindy effect.
The Lindy effect exactly just formalizes that rule. For non-perishable things, ideas, books, technologies, their life expectancy is proportional to their current age. So if a book has been in print for 40 years, you can expect it to be in print for another 40 years. If a technology has been around for a century, its odds of being around for another century are very high.
Which is completely counterintuitive to our cultural obsession with the new, what the book calls neomania.
Right, neomania. The love of the new for its own sake, this belief that because something is new, it must be better. And it's often tied to the treadmill effect. You see it with phones and software. You get the newest upgrade, you feel good for a week, and then you're back to your baseline and already looking for the next new thing.
And that cycle makes us fragile.
Psychologically and financially fragile. And the irony is that the new, by definition, is untested. It hasn't faced the filter of time. When you actually stop and look, the technologies that endure are ancient. They are Lindy-proof.
We still drink wine.
6,000 years old.
Yeah.
We still use the wheel for transport. We still sit in taverns, a concept that's 25 centuries old. Meanwhile, all those grand forecasts from the 50s and 60s about flying cars and cities on the moon, they consistently fail. What lasts are the simple, robust things.
So via negativa leads us right back to that core practical tool, the barbell strategy, avoiding that fragile middle ground.
The barbell is your best non-predictive defense. Since you can't predict the big rare events, you just structure your life and your investments to be immune to them. You make sure the probability of total ruin is 0 while keeping yourself open to massive positive surprises.
Eliminate the extreme downside, keep the extreme upside, and the key is deliberately getting out of the middle. Why is the middle so dangerous?
The middle ground, what people call medium risk, is a total trap. It's a trap because those kinds of risks are subject to huge measurement errors. You think you know the probability, but you don't. The risks are all correlated in hidden ways, and it gives you this false sense of security.
So the barbell simplifies it.
Radically. It's like 90% of your assets in something ultra-safe cash, treasury bills, something boring, and the other 10% in the most speculative, high-risk, high-upside ventures you can find.
So you know your maximum possible loss is just that 10%. It's capped. But your potential gain is still huge.
You've effectively removed the risk of ruin from the equation. It's what great investors like Ray Dalio always talk about. Make sure that the probability of the unacceptable is nil.
And this isn't just about finance.
Not at all. Look at Sweden after the financial crisis in the early 90s. They completely changed their approach. They started running perpetual budget surpluses, minimizing their national debt. It's a defensive via negativa posture. By removing the risk of a debt crisis, they were able to just shrug off later global financial storms. The barbell is about separating things, not mashing your steak and your cake together. You limit your size, limit your concentration, and you let antifragility work for you.
Which brings us to book 7, and maybe the most profound part of this whole philosophy, the ethics of it all. If antifragility means you gain from chaos, then there has to be a moral rule to govern that.
There has to be. And the chief ethical rule is simple, and it's absolute. Thou shalt not have antifragility at the expense of the fragility of others. That's the bedrock.
Because without that rule, you get systems designed for exploitation.
You do. The single biggest reason for modern crises is the complete absence of skin in the game. If you can get all the benefits from taking a risk and then someone else has to pay the price when it all goes wrong, that system is not just unstable, it's deeply immoral.
And modern society seems to have perfected this transfer of fragility.
It's been institutionalized. It's carried out by what the book calls inverse heroes, the bureaucrats, the bankers, the policy wonks, the academics who have huge influence but zero personal downside. They game the system.
They keep the upside for themselves.
They get the bonuses, the promotions, the prestige when things go well, but they systematically offload all the downside risk onto the public, onto the taxpayer. The 2008 financial crisis was a masterclass in this. They used complexity to hide these massive blow-up risks, creating a system where the bankers were anti-fragile and the public was left hyper-fragile.
And this is such a break from historical norms where being in charge meant taking risks yourself. The captain goes down with the ship.
Exactly. The Roman general had to lead from the front. The historical norm was symmetrical. Leaders were personally exposed to the consequences of their own decisions, but the modern expert is structurally insulated from all that. They can advise a policy that ruins millions of lives, and they just commute home safely. Their career is fine. That asymmetry is the ethical failure.
This lack of accountability is a huge moral hazard. The book gives the example of the Joseph Stiglitz problem.
It's a stark example. Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner, he and his colleagues gave risk assessments for Fannie Mae before it collapsed. Their formal conclusion, which was incredibly influential, was that the risk of a default to taxpayers was, and I'm quoting here, effectively zero.
And then it collapsed, costing taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hundreds of billions. And what happened to the academics who made that call? Nothing. Zero professional penalty. They didn't lose their tenure, their speaking fees, or intellectual authority. They were free to just cherry-pick their past statements and keep offering advice. They were anti-fragile. Their careers were fine at the direct expense of the public's fragility.
So the failure isn't just making a bad prediction. It's the system that allows them to avoid the cost of being wrong.
That's the core of the agency problem, and it gets even more insidious when you look at the Ellen Blinder problem, which really gets into the gap between what's legal and what's ethical.
Well, Blinder was a former vice chairman of the Fed.
Right, he was. And after leaving public office, he helped market an investment product. Now, the product was perfectly legal, but its entire purpose was to help very wealthy people get around the federal deposit insurance limits.
So using a government program designed to protect regular people to give the super rich extra free taxpayer-backed insurance.
That's exactly what it was. And when he was challenged on the morality of exploiting a system he used to run, the defense was just, it's legal. The firm even hired former regulators specifically because they knew all the loopholes.
Wow.
It's a profound ethical violation, using insider knowledge from public service for personal gain while staying just on the right side of the law.
So it's the cure for this. The ancients had a solution, didn't they? Hammurabi's Code.
Almost 4,000 years old, and it's the ultimate solution to the agency problem. It's all about forcing symmetrical fragility.
What was the rule?
The famous one is about builders. It says that if a builder builds a house and that house collapses and kills the owner's son, then the builder's son shall be put to death.
That's intense.
It's incredibly intense, but it's not about cruelty. It's about risk management.
Yeah.
The builder has private asymmetric information. He knows if the foundation is solid. He knows the quality of the materials. This rule forces him to use the absolute best of everything because his own family's survival is literally on the line. It completely eliminates the agency problem by making the hidden risk visible and personal.
That kind of symmetrical risk should be the foundation of governance.
And when we talk about this, we have to talk about interventionism. That compulsion to just do something is often the most dangerous force there is.
Which brings us back to medicine and its core ethical rule. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm.
Exactly. Iatrogenics, the harm caused by the healer, by the doctor, by the policymaker, is often way worse than the original problem, especially in marginal cases. The burden of proof has to be on the person who wants to intervene, the person proposing some new additive policy. You need overwhelming proof that you're not going to cause systemic harm.
And a perfect example of this kind of iatrogenic harm was the introduction of trans fats.
A catastrophic example. So scientists, convinced they could engineer a better fat, invented trans fats. The academic consensus was that they were healthier than butter or lard, and so they were pushed into the food supply all over the world.
And it took decades to see the real effects.
Decades. Only much later did the evidence become undeniable that these things were causing heart disease on a massive scale. It was an unnatural intervention driven by scientific hubris and a total lack of skin in the game for the people promoting it. And it caused systemic global harm.
This tension between intervention and nature, it applies to life itself. The individual, you or me, we're fragile, but the species, the gene pool, is anti-fragile.
Evolution is ruthless. For the system to get stronger, for the gene pool to adapt to stressors, individual organisms have to fail. They have to die. Businesses have to go bankrupt. If you try to prevent every local manageable failure, you just transfer that fragility up to the entire system and you set it up for one massive catastrophic collapse.
The book uses the sinking of the Titanic as a strange sort of example of this.
It does. The engineer Henry Petrosky made this point. The sinking of the Titanic was a horrific tragedy. It cost hundreds of lives. But paradoxically, it probably saved more lives than were lost.
Wow.
Because if it hadn't sunk, the lessons would never have been learned. The regulations on lifeboats and ship design would never have been changed, and we would have just kept building bigger and more dangerous ships, leading to an even worse disaster down the line. The people who died were, in a very real and tragic sense, an investment in the system's future anti-fragility.
And that leads to a huge ethical dilemma for modern society, doesn't it? How do you protect the individual, provide safety nets and dignity, but still allow for the failure that the system needs to innovate?
That's the central tension. We have to prevent people from starving, absolutely. But we can't bail out every massive failed corporation. When we protect the big players from the consequences of their own stupidity, we're transferring fragility from the incompetent to the collective. We have to accept the localized failure of an individual company so that the whole system can learn and get stronger.
And finally, this idea of skin in the game goes beyond just money or physical risk. It extends to our ideas. Soul in the game.
Doxastic commitment. It's a fantastic term. It means being willing to pay a real price. Your reputation, your social standing, your job for your core beliefs. That's what separates a real thinker from an intellectual entertainer, from someone who just throws out ideas because there's no downside for them if they're wrong.
Aristotle said a man is only truly free if he's free with his opinions.
And that usually comes from being free from dependence on some institution that can fire you. You can't be a half person, half intellectual. Dignity isn't free. It requires taking on some risk. Right. Having soul in the game means you can't escape the consequences of what you say. The person who stakes their reputation on their ideas, that's the person you should listen to, because they are structurally bound to the truth.
Wow. This has been a monumental deep dive. It really confirms that this non-predictive approach isn't just a survival tactic. It's a more robust, more ethical way to live. The takeaways seem pretty clear. Use optionality, avoid the non-linearity traps, subtract the harmful stuff with via negativa, and always, always have skin and soul in the game.
We've established that evolution and innovation are, well, they're inherently ruthless processes. They thrive on the necessary failure of the individual. So if our whole system gets stronger from the mistakes and the bankruptcies of entrepreneurs and risk takers, the provocative question for you is this: should society honor those ruined risk takers, the people who took the hit for the collective good, with the same kind of respect and support we give to fallen soldiers? Should we see their failure as an investment in our collective anti-fragility? Or does accepting that kind of individual sacrifice just fundamentally violate the core Enlightenment idea that we should protect the individual above all else?
Thank you for watching, though do not forget like, share, subscribe, follow for the next video.